Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 98th Stephen A. Ogden Jr. 60 Memorial Lecture on International Affairs. The Ogden Lecture, as many of you know, is one of Brown's oldest and most distinguished lectures. Since the first Ogden Lecture in 1965, the university has welcomed heads of state, senior diplomats, senators, prime ministers, prominent journalists, and other observers of the international scene, and they've spoken from personal experience about global issues. The Ogden Lectures were established as a memorial to Stephen A. Ogden Jr., a member of the Brown class of 1960, who passed away during his junior year, and the lectures reflect his dream of promoting international peace through a career in international relations. And so today it is my distinct honor to introduce the former president of Mexico and currently director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization, Ernesto Zedillo. As president, he was an historic reformer, an accidental candidate thrust into an election in the wake of an assassination. President Zedillo was quick to recognize a window of change in Mexican political and economic life. His signature achievement, or one of his signature achievements, was opening a virtual one-party system to competition, pushing through an electoral law in 1996 that provided for an independent electoral board, federal campaign funds for all parties, and more equitable access to the media. It was a move that really transformed Mexico's elections and revitalized the country's democratic culture. He is a Yale-trained economist, and as in that role, he also succeeded in stabilizing Mexico's finances during his tenure, taming inflation, lowering unemployment, bolstering economic growth, and handing over a robust economy to his successor, Vicente Fox. President Zedillo's economic legacy is widely credited with the dramatic expansion of the Mexican middle class during the last 2 decades. And his deep commitment to poverty reduction is perhaps best remembered in his administration's launch of the Progresa program, an initiative which was a conditional cash transfer program, very innovative in its time. Millions of people benefited from the program, which provided poor families with financial assistance on the condition that their children went to school and got health clinic checkups. When he left office in 2000, at the height of his popularity, President Zedillo was well-positioned to engage in shaping global conversations on foreign policy and global affairs. His calling card was, and still is, an abiding trust in multilateralism and international institutions. Speaking at the Harvard commencement in 2003, President Zedillo harkened back to a time when the multilateral system was rightfully credited for forging a convergence of values around democracy, around individual liberty, and the rule of law, and for lifting millions out of poverty. He lauded the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and NATO for their roles in, quote, promoting the causes of peace, prosperity, and human rights, and helping to decisively improve the quality of human life in the last 50 years. So this faith has always been a cornerstone of President Zedillo's worldview, and it's more important than ever at a time when democratic institutions seem to be backsliding around the globe, and when challenges like climate change demand global cooperation in a way like they've never had before. As he demonstrated during his presidency, he is at heart a problem solver. And so he's continued to lend his expertise and leadership experience to high-level initiatives aimed at addressing several intractable global issues. And he's chaired or co-chaired too many global commissions and task forces for me to mention, but I'll give examples of a few. One is that he serves on the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which seeks to reframe the global war on drugs and examine new approaches to ending the criminalization and marginalization of drug users. His work with the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament culminated in a 2009 report, Eliminating Nuclear Threats, a Practical Agenda for Global Policymakers. And in one final example, his efforts on climate change produced the edited volume, Global Warming, Looking Beyond Kyoto. That was published in 2008. So In a tribute to his distinguished record of international public service, President Zedillo was invited to join the Elders, which is a London-based organization founded by the late Nelson Mandela 11 years ago. And with that appointment, he joined a pantheon of global leaders, among them 2 recent Ogden lecturers, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the former President of Brazil, Fernando Cardoso, in advancing a high-level agenda of peace, equality, and human rights. He is unquestionably a consummate internationalist and an accomplished global leader who clearly honors the ideals of the Ogden Lecture. So on behalf of the entire Brown University community, please join me in welcoming President Ernesto Zedillo. Thank you.
President Paxton, Mr. Provost, dear faculty members, dear students, dear friends of this great university. I am very pleased to be back at Brown University and to come tonight before this distinguished audience from this admirable institution. I want to start by expressing my gratitude to President Paxton for her invitation to deliver the Stephen A. Ogden Jr. Lecture on International Affairs, as well as for her presence here and generous remarks. I also want to acknowledge the presence here tonight of my dear friend and colleague from the Group of 30, Bill Rhodes. I should mention that I have had the pleasure of meeting more than a few Brown University persons, but hardly any as devoted as Bill. I'm glad to see you. Allow me to introduce tonight's topic by recalling that exactly 10 years ago, the world economy was on the brink of suffering its darkest episode since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The financial panic lived during the fall of 2008 not only marked the end of the so-called Great Moderation, but also perhaps the beginning of a period of twilight for modern globalization. The decade or so that preceded the great crisis of 2008-09 was, by several measures, a mini golden era for globalization, which had been painstakingly rebuilt after its destruction during the Great Depression and the Second World War. Globalization had intensified markedly in the 1990s to the point that already by the end of the 20th century, it had surpassed, at least on the trade and financial fronts, that phenomenon's previous golden era a century earlier. During the mini golden era of contemporary globalization, it wasn't only that trade in goods and services, as well as capital flows across borders, grew to unprecedented levels, but also that a process of economic convergence between the developed and the emerging and developing countries took place at last. Part of this story of economic convergence is that during the last few decades, the group of rich countries registered a slower growth than before. By far, however, convergence has been more about the faster growth of developing countries. In fact, it is precisely those countries that, having been relatively close a few decades ago, took the crucial step around the late 1980s to integrate decisively into the global economy that have driven this growth. In less than a quarter of a century, a group of developing countries, home to more than 55% of the world's population, while doubling the ratio of trade to GDP and becoming more open to foreign direct investment, were able to raise their per capita GDP at more than twice the rate of rich countries. Significantly, they also reduced both the number and proportion of their people living in extreme poverty, despite substantial population increases. In the economic rebalancing occurring during our time, although there have been many developing countries achieving rates of economic growth above those of rich countries, the case of China stands out among all of them. China's growth has been an accelerator of the new pattern of international production and trade that created unprecedented opportunities for other developing countries while allowing developed ones to have new fast-growing outlets for their own products, investments, and technologies. That growth also enlarged the pool of global savings, thus helping to loosen financial constraints, not least for the United States. Ironically, the latter aspect of China's success was also part of the story that led to the financial crisis that interrupted the mini-golden era of globalization. It is now commonly and wrongly believed that the crisis was caused alone by recklessness on the part of private financial institutions, mainly US, but also European ones. And it seems to be forgotten that, in truth, the turmoil also had some deep macroeconomic policy mismanagements and imbalances as its primary causes. Quite aside from the well-documented, incompetent, and foolhardy behavior of a number of financial institutions in a context of weakened financial regulation and supervision, without the massive borrowing by some countries and the massive lending by others, and of course the policies and structural factors underlying such imbalances, it would have been impossible to create such a tremendous economic disaster. Those global macroeconomic imbalances were bound to cause trouble, and they did. Although the crisis originated and spread from the US financial markets, it soon became apparent that no significant economy would be spared the pain and actually the guilt from having allowed the roots of the crisis to grow so strong. For a while, the members of the Eurozone proclaimed themselves as victims and not culprits of the disaster on the basis that they had managed to keep a nearly balanced current account for the Union as a whole. They were failing to acknowledge that serious macroeconomic imbalances did exist within the European Monetary Union, those between its northern members, chiefly Germany, and their southern partners. The truth is that Germany's current account surpluses were, among other things, feeding consumption binges in Greece, supporting exuberant construction booms in Spain and Ireland, funding unsustainable fiscal deficits in Portugal, and even helping to inflate the real estate bubble in the United States, as more than a few of the German banks' balance sheets painfully revealed in due time. Japan was another country that failed to consider the effect of its large surpluses on its trading partners. Extravagant claims about being decoupled from the US travails were also foolishly entertained in some important countries in Latin America. The commodity supercycle that more or less survived until 2014 was the opioid that caused the leaders of those countries to rest on their laurels and fail to recognize the illnesses that had infected our economies well before the crisis. The chief consequence of the Latin American complacency of a few years ago is that as the global economy gained enough momentum to leave the great crisis behind, the opposite happened in our region. Sensibly, if only after the fact, the G20 leaders were right on target when at their first Washington summit of November 15, 2008, they identified insufficiently coordinated macroeconomic policies at the root of the crisis that had erupted with great force that fall. They recognized that as their national economies had become more interdependent, which had been positive for growth, this interdependence had also exacerbated policy challenges, including the need for more, not less, macroeconomic policy coordination. Unfortunately, that admission and the pledge to fix it were made too late and were short-lived. The world has not and will not be the same after Lehman Brothers collapse on September 15, 2008. It is evident that the prospects for most economies, even in the presence of the relatively benign world output growth figures of 2017 and 2018, are very different from the ones entertained only a bit more than a decade or so ago. We are living through a period of diminished expectations. Although the list of factors suspected of contributing to the deflation of global growth expectations is not an insignificant one, not least as it includes both the mystery of reduced growth productivity as well as the aging of the labor force in advanced countries. Particular consideration must be given to the question of whether globalization, a significant growth engine, might have peaked already and could even be at risk of reverting. The confirmation of this presumption should be hugely concerning for those like myself who believe that the payoff of trade expansion has been, on balance, quite favorable not only for global growth of both developed and developing countries, but also to increase average per capita income, reduce poverty rates, and accelerate human development in many emerging countries. We get some relief about this concern from those who submit the view that for the most part the trade slowdown has been driven essentially by cyclical factors, such as the weaknesses in aggregate demand caused by the Great Crisis over several years. Be that as it may, even analysis more supportive of the cyclical nature of the trade slowdown acknowledge that there might be other factors at play that should not by any means be overlooked. Among those factors, there are some that should have been expected, such as the completion of the phase of fast integration of China and the Central and Eastern European economies into the global economy, a transition that by definition could not last forever. But there are other non-cyclical circumstances that should be of true concern. One is, of course, that the multilateral efforts to further liberalize trade had failed terribly for many years, not least the Doha Round, now totally defunct despite the multiple pledges to complete it made by the G20 in the aftermath of the crisis. Another is the increase in protectionism, rather quietly, in a murky way, avoiding large-scale increases in the average level of protection that took place over several years, again, despite the solemn pledges of the G20. The failure of further multilateral liberalization and the occurrence of creeping protectionism were bad enough for the prospects of global growth, but a much worse scenario has now emerged as a consequence of the trade wars that seem actively being pursued by the government of none other than the major economic power of the world, the United States. This is a scenario that, unthinkable until recently, now seems to be materializing. The current US government has provided ample evidence, rather aggressively, of its protectionist stance. There was, of course, the very early decision by the Trump administration to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, an action never really satisfactorily justified by the US president or any member of his cabinet. There was also the action to initiate the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, on false or at best wrong-headed premises. In May 2017, when the formal announcement to start the renegotiation process was made, the United States Trade Representative, USTR, argued that the quarter-of-a-century-old agreement no longer reflected the standards warranted by changes in the economy. This may have sounded plausible before noticing that the to-do list to update the agreement had already been addressed in the discarded TPP, of which both Mexico and Canada were a part also. The US government's peculiar approach in dealing with its allies and trade partners was confirmed when the USTR published, as required by law, the objectives for the renegotiation. That document falsely associated NAFTA with the explosion of US trade deficits, the closure of thousands of factories, and the abandonment of millions of American workers. These deceptive premises might help to explain why so little progress had been made after almost 1 year of talks. Betting in mid-July of 2018 for a conclusion of the renegotiation of NAFTA within the targeted time frame would have looked like an overwhelming losing proposition. After 7 rounds of negotiation with little or no progress, the last round having taken place as far back as February 2018, followed by several months of deadlock and even rhetorical confrontation. The deadlock was quite understandable. The US trade representatives had not moved a single inch from their more or most outlandish demands, giving credence to the idea that what they were really seeking was to get a deal that, far from promoting investment and trade among the NAFTA partners, that deal will destroy it. Fortunately, the Canadian and Mexican governments did not cave to the US government's pretension. Repeatedly, those countries' chief negotiators expressed firmly and credibly that they would rather take the unilateral termination of NAFTA by the United States than sign an agreement that would have the same practical consequence. As August approached, the US government started to move away from most of the recalcitrant positions it had held for almost a year. The important fact is that it did, leading to a deal first with Mexico on August 27, and then with Canada in the last hours of September 30 of this year. The only significant demand by the US accommodated by Mexico and Canada was in the automotive sector, where more restrictive and cumbersome rules of origin would be adopted. Fortunately, the destructive effects of the new rules of origin for trade and investment could be mitigated, in the case of cars, by the provision that vehicles failing to fulfill those rules, which nobody will be able to comply with, would simply pay the low most favored nation tariff of 2.5%, as long as total exports do not exceed an agreed reasonable number of vehicles. Other things being equal, however, it is clear that the new regime will reduce both the regional and global competitiveness of the North American automotive industry, a result that will not be good for American, Canadians, or Mexican workers. Of course, other things will not be equal if the US government decides to impose tariffs, as it has threatened to do, on vehicles produced by European or Asian companies. If those tariffs were imposed, the burden of the new regime would fall disproportionately on the American consumer. As purported from day one, the trade agreement will be subject to an update on a number of topics such as digital trade, intellectual property rights, environmental policies, and labor practices. Interestingly, the agreed new provisions really are a cut and paste of what was contained in the TPP, discarded early by the Trump administration. A decision discarding TPP is so damaging to American interests that it will always be a mystery for economic and political historians. NAFTA negotiations aside, trade hostilities by the United States generally escalated significantly in 2018. In January, safeguard tariffs on solar panels and washing machines were announced. Next, invoking national security arguments and implausible argument for commodity metals, the US government imposed high tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum from China, effective in March, as well as imports from the European Union, Japan, Turkey, Canada, and Mexico, effective early July 2018. Predictably, all the affected trade partners responded at once by announcing their own retaliatory trade actions. The confrontation with China intensified with the announcement, effective July, of tariffs of US imports from that country worth $34 billion. The stated rationale was unfair trade practices. By September 2018, the total value of Chinese imports subject to US tariffs had risen to $250 billion, with tariffs on a further $236 billion threatened. It did not take long, in fact, only a few hours, for China to respond in kind to the US action. At this time, the Trump administration is vowing to react with even more tariffs on imports from countries challenging its arbitrary actions. The trade aggressiveness, rather than an intelligent use of diplomacy against China, is not easy to understand, not only because hardly any robust evidence has been provided about the imputed unfairness of China's own trade practices, that, if true, would warrant a strong case to be judged by the WTO appellate body, but also because it seems to ignore other aspects of the already significant interdependence between the American and Chinese economies. Among other things, the US government overlooks the effect of China's imports from the US in supporting the latter's, the US economic growth, as well as the favorable impact of the lower price of Chinese exports on the real wage of American workers. It equally seems to dismiss that the US trade deficit with China helps to feed the latter's current account surplus, which is simply a consequence of the excess savings available in the Chinese economy, and that the US has been happy to borrow over many years to compensate for its own very low savings rate. It is hard to know whether the American administration really believes that sooner rather than later, China and the other targeted countries will succumb to the United States' outlandish demands and thus deliver a win, quote, in the still incipient confrontation. If this were the assumption, most likely a wrong one, that trade war could reach epic proportions with irreversible damage. Even worse, however, the US authorities could be envisioning a scenario in which the affected parties implement full recourse to the WTO, and this is taken as an excuse to withdraw from that institution, as President Trump has sometimes threatened to do. This episode of American neo-mercantilism can hardly have a happy ending, simply because it has been launched on very wrong premises and with questionable objectives. The US government's ongoing policy not only ignores the notion of comparative advantage and its modern incarnation into complex supply chains, but also the essential insight from open economy macroeconomics that the difference between an economy's national income and its expenditure is what drives the current account and trade balances. Playing with trade policy without looking at the underlying variables of income and expenditure is bound to be futile and, frankly, counterproductive. Furthermore, focusing on bilateral balances to fix the aggregate, one makes the undertaking even more pointless. How far and how deep the newly adopted American protectionist stance is taken will determine more than any other circumstance whether modern globalization is in its twilight or simply recedes temporarily. Of course, other factors that must be duly acknowledged will be at play to determine the ultimate outcome. But the decisive weight of US policies need to be factored properly into any exercise of prognosis about globalization. If the capricious withdrawal from the TPP, the arbitrary imposition of import tariffs against products of its main trading partners, and the unjustified rhetoric that accompanied the renegotiation of NAFTA were the guide to predict the gravity of US policies, it would be prudent to envision a dramatic compression of globalization in the years to come. This would happen in a scenario where a tit-for-tat vicious cycle of rising trade barriers happens along with the annihilation, formal or de facto, of the WTO and the other cooperative instruments that exist to govern international trade and investment. Obviously, this would be an outcome, economic and otherwise, of practically catastrophic proportions for the US, its main trading partners, and all the other participants in the global economy. A considerably less disruptive scenario could be imagined if the process to devolve NAFTA into a United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, were the relevant guide. As argued before, the New Deal, if ratified, while not really a meaningful improvement over NAFTA, would still be capable of allowing a reasonable degree of mutually convenient trade, not optimal but substantial among the three trade partners. Fortunately for all involved, the protectionist rhetoric displayed by the American authorities was not matched at the end by their actions to conclude the deal. In fact, the termination of NAFTA would have been the only outcome matching the aggressive and bombastic positions they held from the beginning to right before the end of the talks. The equally bombastic exaggerations utilized to announce the purported virtues of the new agreement could also be suggestive. The script that seemed to be used by the US government in the NAFTA negotiations was: demand unreasonably, negotiate aggressively, make any possible deal, declare victory, and move on. If this were truly the blueprint that the US government intends to follow to restructure the country's trade relations with the rest of the world, then the damage, if not negligible, will be contained. But even in the least pessimistic scenario, other important issues will have to be addressed in the years to come if a twilight of contemporary globalization is going to be avoided and it is allowed instead to continue being, on balance, a powerful force for prosperity and international peace and security. For one thing, all the other major economic powers of the world should deal intelligently with the ongoing American predicament, with a view to certainly contain the aggressiveness of the US actions while doing their utmost to protect the rules-based international system. Those powers should commit their collective and coordinated action to compensate for the US retrenchment from the multilateral institutions and the provision of global public goods. They will have to be more proactive in their support of institutions and agreements such as the United Nations, the Bretton Woods organizations, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and many more. Although it will be very hard, if not impossible, to do it without the concurrence of the United States, the reform and strengthening of the multilateral system, not only in its purely economic aspects, but in its entirety, is a necessary condition to deal effectively with the challenges posed by economic interdependence while benefiting the most from it. On the trade front, it is necessary and unavoidable, although unfortunate, that those powers continue reacting in a targeted fashion to the US trade restrictive moves. But it must be done in a way that complies with the WTO framework. They must also be more forthcoming about their support for that institution, abandoning the passivity or even free-riding attitude that sometimes has prevailed in the past, not least over the failed Doha round. Those powers will also have to address more decisively some important domestic challenges. For example, China, whose leadership has come forward to champion globalization in the face of the American retreat, should, in its own interest, move faster in its process of domestic reform. The European Union, nowadays the most benign pole on the map of world powers, should expedite its consolidation, a task that, among many things, implies dealing properly with the march of folly that Brexit is, and do what it takes to make the European Monetary Union unquestionably viable and resilient. Crucially, for globalization to deliver to its full potential, all governments should take more seriously the essential insight provided by economics that open markets need to be accompanied by policies that make their impact less disruptive and more beneficially inclusive for the population at large. Advocates of globalization should also be more effective in contending with the conundrum posed by the fact that it has become pervasive, even for serious academics, some serious academics, to postulate almost mechanical a causal relationship between open markets and many social and economic ills. Linking abominable inequities to trade and even to technological progress, as has become fashionable, misses the point entirely on two important accounts. First, because it denies that those inequities are much more consequence of explicit domestic policies unrelated to trade issues. By focusing on the latter, the important fact that the inequities are fundamentally the result of past political choices is overlooked. Second, by committing this omission, it becomes more likely to incur in serious policy mistakes, with the practical consequence that the inequities purported as undesirable will tend to be further perpetuated. Trade policy will never be a first best one to deal with the problems that rightly have increasingly captured the attention of citizens and political leaders in most countries, both developed and emerging, such as poverty, increasing inequality, and marginalization. These ills, less the result of historical initial conditions than of deliberate policy decisions by political leaders unduly influenced over time by the holders of economic power, if they are to be addressed seriously, it must be done with institutions and policies conformed explicitly for such purposes. This is a clear-cut political choice that obviously poses a trade-off with other objectives, for example, lower taxation, that may be considered important by some economic and political constituencies. The real dilemmas must be acknowledged and acted upon, and not evaded as is done when tweaking trade policy is wrongly alleged to be the instrument with which to address unacceptable social ills. President Paxton, dear members of the Brown community, for sure, globalization has rough edges. Chiefly among them is potential distributional consequences that must be handled better than has been the case, certainly in the United States. But globalization is on balance a powerful force for good in the world. For today's rich countries, it has been a vital engine for growth. Their interdependence through trade and capital flows has meant enormous possibilities for growth and prosperity. Bigger markets and more intense competition flowing from the elimination of barriers to trade and investment have been crucial elements in increasing productivity, lowering prices for consumers, and raising incomes. In the developing world, globalization has been a vital force in reducing poverty by supporting economic growth. The exact quantitative impact of economic integration on growth is still a matter of debate, but it is a fact that increasing openness, economic growth, and poverty alleviation have occurred together in the most successful developing countries. If the economic and social benefits of greater interdependence are not persuasive enough, we should consider the benefits for peace and security. Serious historical and statistical analysis have confirmed the validity of Immanuel Kant's assertion in his 1795 work, Perpetual Peace, that, and I quote, "The spirit of commerce sooner than later takes hold of every people, and it cannot exist side by side with war. Thus, states find themselves compelled to promote the noble cause of peace, though not exactly from motives of morality. And wherever in the world there is a threat of war breaking out, they will try to prevent it by mediation." Kant was right. Trade does increase the prospects for peace. Economic interdependence significantly reduces the likelihood that two states will be in conflict. And that is not only bilateral trade that makes conflict less probable. Openness in general has a substantial pacifying effect. By the same token, or better said, a contrariu sensu, the evidence indicates that if economic interdependence declines, the prospects for conflict rise. This observation, above and beyond the purely economic consequences of protectionism, is what should be of most concern about the possibility of globalization stalling and even reversing. The world can endure and overcome economic disasters caused by the great powers' rivalry, but the pain would be immensely bigger for all if that economic rivalry led to bellicose confrontation. That is a lesson of history that must not be forgotten. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for a wonderful talk. We have some time for Q&A questions and conversation with President Zedillo. I'm going to start with a couple questions of my own while people gather their thoughts and decide what they want to ask. And as always, we have microphones on both sides, so if people want to ask a question, they can come down and line up behind those two mics. So let me just start with a little bit of conversation about democracy in Latin America. And Carlos Fuentes, who until his death was professor at large at Brown, he said something about you once. He said you were the only Mexican president who finished his term without picking his own successor, which is a lesson in democratic integrity. I don't know if you ever heard him say that. But you know, given that you're in a situation now, where a number of Latin American countries have recently elected right-wing leaders, Mexico being an exception. What do you think about the prospects for Mexico? Are you at all concerned? How do you view what's going on right now in Latin America?
Well, you know, one of the reasons I have been over the last few years outspoken about the risks of populism is indeed because of my Latin American condition. Although populism, according to historians, started in this country in the 1890s, others say in Russia in the 1890s too. Russia and the US are always fighting, not always for good things. Actually, the masters of populism have been Latin America. We have endured historically populism in countries like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and many others. So in a way, we are experts for the wrong reason. We have paid a lot for populism. That's a very bad news. The very good news is that all of them have finished eventually. And not so good news, because I don't wish any tragedy to anybody, and certainly not to the United States, is that all populist governments in Latin America, all, no exceptions, have finished in tragedy. And when I say tragedy, it's real human tragedy for the people who have suffered it and also for the populist leaders. You know, just think about Brazil with Getúlio Vargas, how he finished, you know, committed suicide. You think about Perón in Argentina, or now the Kirchners in Argentina, or President Allende in Chile, or one or few disgraced presidents in Mexico, right? All those stories are stories of tragedy. And right now we are going back to that concern, because for many reasons, economic and otherwise, we are now seeing this wave of populism reemerging in some of our countries. And I don't care whether it's right-wing or left-wing. You know, populism at the end, you never know which one is worse. The two of them are very bad, from the right or from the left. And that's right now our main concern. What is the mitigating factor now in Latin America? And today there is an interesting interview made to President Cardoso in El País. You know, I say it because I know that President Cardoso has a strong link with Brown University, and they ask him, well, are you very worried about Bolsonaro? Yes, I don't like the man, but I don't think this is going to be the end of modern democracy in Brazil by any means, because we have built institutions, we have citizens that have a voice and are active, you know, and nobody really voted for the end of democracy in Brazil. They voted for this person, but institutions will work. So that's my hope about all of those countries in Latin America that are suffering or will suffer this populist renaissance.
Thank you. So one more question before, I know we have a lot, but I have to ask this one. So Brown alumna Roberta Jacobson recently stepped down as the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. And after she stepped down, she wrote an op-ed that gave a pretty damning verdict of the state of U.S.-Mexico relationships. And I'll read her quote. She said, "Over the past 3 decades, successive American administrations have worked diligently to vanquish the anti-American DNA in Mexico. We were overcoming the suspicions that a history of invasion, territorial loss, and imperial intent have bequeathed. That kind of trust is slow to build and remarkably easy to destroy. It's being destroyed now." And I guess, do you agree with that? And do you think it is so easily destructible and so hard to bring back?
Well, we have to acknowledge facts. And one fact is that the campaign or the announcement of the intention to campaign by the current President of the United States, in its very initial first paragraph pronouncement, was an attack against the dignity of the Mexican people by characterizing all Mexicans coming to the United States in rather insulting terms. And that doesn't help all along the way in which President Trump has spoken not only about Mexicans, but also about people from other parts of the world. And then there are other actions, like I talk about NAFTA and the rhetoric that was used to announce it and to conduct a negotiation throughout most of the process was unfortunate. So I guess that has damaged somehow the view entertained by the Mexican citizens and government officials towards the United States. But I think the good news is that the relationship has proven to be more resilient than that. I would have expected by now more aggressive and responses in kind from the part of Mexican people. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened because it's not right. You should never use that kind of attitudes. And it will not be productive for Mexico and for the United States. So I hope that whatever damage is being made, and I admit that there is a damage, I think the ambassador is right, is not a permanent damage. And rather sooner than later, you know, we will retake the road of respect, mutual respect and cooperation.
Thank you very much. So let's turn to questions, and we'll start over here. The one thing I would say is please keep your questions as questions, and I'll appreciate that very much. Well, there you go. So please.
Thank you. Mr. President, I'm not an economist, so my question's pretty basic. What I understand is that President Trump is simply trying to make sure that the United States is treated equally and fairly when we trade with China, for example. His argument, as I understand it, is they tax our goods a lot more than we tax their goods, and he just wants to even that out. And my question is, what's wrong with that? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question, and I thank you for that. That's what it is said, but I think we have to review the facts. Let's see what has happened with China. And I'm not going to defend China. You know, Mexico was the country most affected by China's coming into the global economy, into the WTO and so on. Although I will never criticize China for that. They did what they wanted and needed to do for their own people, and we knew that they were coming, right? But let's see what has happened. What country has opened more its markets to the other, China or the United States in the last 30 years? What is the answer? China. Yeah, because China was a closed economy. And China has lowered immensely its trade tariffs, as compared to what they had 30 years ago. And that has been the experience. The US took the decision many years ago for good, and that's why this country is really great, to be an open country, an open economy, right? Part or most of the prosperity of this country could not be explained without that wise policy that has been followed. And after many years of having countries like the US doing that, developing countries decided to open up. And the opening of those countries has been dramatic over the last 30 years, not only to trade, but also to investment. Are those countries as open today as the United States is? I would say no, but it has been a process which has been dramatic, much faster than the one that the US did historically. It was much slower, the process in this country. And in addition, if there are grievances about China violating rules, we happen to have an institution that actually, for the most part, has been created by the United States. And I would say in its modern form, it was molded by the United States, which is the WTO. And the WTO has mechanisms to receive complaints and to decide whether those complaints are valid. So what is not right is to say, I don't like this and not provide facts, and I'm going to act unilaterally and arbitrarily based simply on sayings. Say, okay, if you have the facts, go to the WTO, sue China, and the WTO will decide whether you can punish China imposing tariffs or otherwise instruments to contain a bad behavior. But what is not right is to believe that sovereignty must be relative for everybody but for myself. And that's what the United States is doing. Now, when the President of the United States says to other leaders in the world, you know, I put my country first, I say, wait a minute, do you think that any other president doesn't put his or her country first? We are paid. You know, presidents are paid to put their countries first. Frankly, I mean, I was paid for that, and I swear on my Constitution, right? But that is not in conflict at all with playing by the rules that, by the way, this great country has been totally influential and decisive to build. And the United States has not done it just to be cute to the world. No, it's true. You know, you have to read history. I mean, there was a great thing done after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan. And it was not an act of philanthropy. It had very good consequence, human, real consequence for people who could have starved or fallen into disgrace for many decades. And yet the United States provided the Marshall Plan. But if you go back to history, to the reasoning inside the United States government, because there were two schools of thought. One school of thought would say, okay, now the war is over, let the Europeans drop dead. Whatever they can do, do it. Somebody would say, let Germany become a grassland, you know, so that they can grow sheep and survive on sheep. That was the belief in some sector of the US government. Other part, more enlightened, said, no, wait a minute. That will not happen, because then we will allow first Germany and then the rest of Europe to become part of the Soviet Union. And by then they knew that the Soviet Union had atomic bombs. So they said, no, we must help Europe. We must help Germany, although they were the enemy. And we must embrace and support Germany, right? And that was not thinking about, let's do international philanthropy or solidarity. That was real good thinking, put your country, the US, first. And that's the use of diplomacy, right? But what is happening today, frankly, is to put the US last. Because what is being done is against the interest. This is my modest view, academic view. It's against the interest of the people of the United States. And first and foremost, I would say the weakest economically people in the United States. So I would say, number one, all presidents put their country first. There's nothing novel about that. But usually you like to think it, not to say it like that, because diplomacy and respect to others is very important.
Thank you. Thank you. So question right here, please.
Okay, so as a Mexican citizen, I know that in Mexico right now there's a lot of uncertainty and a little bit of fear about Mexico's new elected president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about your thoughts on this new president and the global economic implications of this new presidency, for example, starting with the cancellation of the airport project in Mexico City.
Well, I think all new presidents go through learning processes in Mexico and everywhere. And I just wish for the good of my country that our new president, who is not yet president, will be president in a few weeks, completes that learning process very fast.
And you were just talking about diplomacy, right? It's
No,
perfect.
not diplomacy.
No, diplomatic speaking.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I really enjoyed your remarks on the benefits of globalization, but I wonder, when we consider the backlash to globalization, whether that's in the changing nature of an economy or the changing nature of a domestic culture, is there an argument to be made that this change is just happening too quickly for people to adapt to, and that it should be slowed down because of that?
I think there are two issues. One is what econometricians, and here we have one who knows about that. There is the identification problem, you know. There are some things that happen in the world, and since they are happening at the same time that globalization happens, some people tend to associate the two with a casual relationship. And I think we have to be very careful. Not only globalization is happening in the world, incredibly fast technological change is happening, and that has economic consequences, most of them extremely good, but others not so good, right? So that's one thing. Second, many of the things, as I mentioned in my talk, that we don't like and that are happening in societies, like worsening income distribution, like people, still large numbers of people who remain in poverty, like the so-called squeeze of the middle class, like the fact that for practically half a century, the median wage in this country didn't grow in real terms. You know, the easy expedient is to say, oh, blame it on globalization. And I would say, no, it's also about other things, including technology, but more fundamentally, all right? Let us mirror ourselves in the mirror and wonder whether policies that have been explicitly decided in the past by political systems, domestic policies that have nothing to do with trade, are not really at the cause of those inequities. And some people say, no, this comes with globalization, or everything else is endogenous to globalization. I said, no, that's not true. You know, I used to be a politician, a policymaker, you know, and I know how some of these, unfortunately, have happened in our societies. You know, the tax reform that was made in this country in the 1980s, or the tax reform that was made in this country in 2002, or the tax reform that was passed last year, eventually will be associated, and have been associated, the two previous ones, to income distribution concentration, right? And this will happen with this tax reform too. So it will be very interesting in 10 or 15 years' time, oh, you know, globalization has further worsened income distribution in the United States. And that's, of course, a lie. I think politicians should take responsibility for the decisions they take to please some constituencies, right? But in the process of pleasing some constituencies, they affect others. And don't blame it on the foreigners. They should take responsibilities for their own decisions.
Thank you. So we have time. We're going to do sort of, what I'm going to do is take 2 questions at a time, and maybe we have time for 4 more questions quickly. I know some people do have to leave to go to class and things like that. That's fine. So let's do a question, and then answer.
Thank you for coming. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on global climate change goals. How are they doing? More specifically, what changes would you make, if any, and what can students at Brown do to make a difference?
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned the importance of open capital flows, and I just wanted to ask, well, or maybe the importance of an open financial system in globalization. And I just wanted to ask, with retrospective clarity, do you regret your decision taken during the Mexican currency crisis, or as they say, the era of December? And do you think the conditions are there now to, or contemporarily, anywhere in the world for that to happen again?
Very different questions.
Okay, yes, on climate change. Well, We had the Paris Agreement. My opinion was, and it still is, that we need much more than the Paris Agreement. But when it was adopted, I had to be realistic, as everybody has to be realistic. Say, okay, this is not really what we need, but at least is a step in the right direction in more than one respect. For one thing, because everybody came on board. It's clear that the Kyoto Agreement was not going to be not even a minor part of the solution, because you had two kinds of countries, one set with obligations and one set with no obligations in terms of emissions. So the Paris Agreement was progress on that, everybody on board. Second, there were non-binding, but still were binding commitments for countries reduce their emissions and so on and so forth. But I insist, not enough. What would have been my own preference, I think that the way to go, there are many things that can be done, but I think as long as we don't have a harmonized, universal carbon price of sufficient magnitude, I don't think we will have a truly powerful instrument to deal with the issue. Or the other things that we are doing, or that countries are doing, or companies are doing, will not be there to the extent that is needed. I mean, it's admirable what has happened with alternative sources of energy over the last 2 decades. But if the price system doesn't help that, well, it's going to be a rather slow process, and maybe it will be too late. I think the latest IPCC report should be, again, you know, a strong call for action. Unfortunately, as we speak, I think the conditions are not good. And again, I have to go back to US foreign policy. The United States withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And that weakens dramatically the agreement, because rather sooner than later, others will be tempted to free ride on those that remained in the agreement. Now, on my talk, I never advocated open financial systems per se. I was very careful avoiding that. I was mostly talking about trade. I do believe in open financial markets, but financial markets must always be intelligently regulated, because they are very delicate things that can become, as we know, weapons of mass destruction. And by the way, the term error de diciembre, mistake of December, was invented and socialized by an individual who wanted to avoid his official and personal responsibility in the fact that I received the country with negative foreign exchange reserves and with liabilities of more than $25 billion to be due within a month. So in those conditions, to fix the exchange rate is impossible.
Thank you. So let's do, I know we're running a little bit late, but two more questions, and then I'm sorry for the others of you who are waiting, we'll be at an end. So what's your question, sir?
Thank you for the historical perspective. My question is, you've spoken about the decisions made by political leaders that have led to increasing income inequality. And there's no question that has been the historic pattern, it's the current pattern. What do you see citizens being able to do to change that policy, where we seem to see popular votes encouraging that policy?
Thank you. And one last question here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I am actually a Mexican citizen, and even though I was very young during your administration, my understanding is that during your administration there were a lot of clashes between the Mexican government and indigenous groups who opposed these neoliberal policies. And these disagreements ultimately ended with 2 indigenous massacres from Acteal and Aguas Blancas. So my question for you now is, from your current experience and from the experience back then, do you believe it's possible to have neoliberal economic policies push economic development, but at the same time respect indigenous people's basic human rights?
Absolutely, and the only qualification is if you were my student, what I will tell you, using labels like characterizing a set of policies as neoliberal or this or that is probably not a rigorous expedient. Usually, I ask my students to be more analytic and descriptive about that. So what do you mean by neoliberal? Asking for fiscal discipline, asking for open markets, asking for investing more on human capital to enhance productivity, and so on and so forth. Well, if you want to call it neoliberal, let's say, okay, it's neoliberal, or whatever you want to call it. The fundamental fact is that in order to have ambitious and effective social policies that combat poverty and diminish inequality and exclusion, you need resources. And the best way to get resources for all of that is economic growth. And if you don't manage your economy properly, you will not have economic growth. So people say, oh, neoliberal policies. Okay, if you have a different way to produce economic growth and have the means to have ambitious social policies, and you should look at the record of the government that I presided on that respect, how much we increase social expenditure, particularly in indigenous communities. What was the effect of the program that the president mentioned, Progresa, on indigenous communities and so on? Well, all of that we couldn't have done without having, let's say, responsible economic policies. There are people who believe that there are alternative policies that can be put in practice and work by virtue of only goodwill. Well, if they believe that, look at Venezuela, right? They have discarded, they said from day one, the neoliberal model. They don't explain what they mean by the neoliberal model. And they have created one of the greatest economic and humanitarian disasters in the history of Latin America, because they didn't have an alternative to generate growth and to make it sustainable and to have the resources, although and this is a unique case in history. You will not find in history, probably, ever, a case of country that has a favorable external shock like Venezuela, because for many years they enjoy a very high price of oil. So the amount of resources that were available to that economy were immense. And by not using those resources in a prudent way, or some would say in a neoliberal way, look what they have done. They almost have destroyed that wonderful country. So we have to be careful about, if we don't like something, we have to express what is the alternative in details.
Thank you very much for coming. We are out of time, but I really appreciate your time and your really great talk. Thank you so much.